Hello everyone and welcome to another video. I guess you could say I upload a little more frequently than Bloodborne gets updates. Was that a good joke? Anyway, as you read in the title, I want to figure out how a good Bloodborne movie would work. I know it's been 10 years since the game came out, and a movie was announced to be somewhat in the works, but ever since, we've received no words or updates. Nothing. I mean, plenty of people have already talked about how Sony just does not want to make money. I mean, all they would have to do is make a PC port and easily they would crack $1 billion, but that's besides the point. This video is about how a screen adaptation of Bloodborne could work. What exact things would need to be in the supposed film to make it something really enjoyable, and also possibly research Sony's appreciation for this gem of a game. As usual, if you want to skip to certain parts of this video, like the concepts for the episodes for example, then feel free to use a progress bar or the description to go to specific chapters. I would also like to say that this video is another research project for a class, so it will have a lot more sources than you might be used to. Before we start though, let's talk about what exactly is Bloodborne. Bloodborne is an award-winning game directed by Hidetaka Miyazaki and developed by From Software for PlayStation, known for its gothic aesthetic, score, and narrative. The nightmarishly difficult horror action game was well received by a multitude of fans of the company who were familiar with the original series Dark Souls, where both games utilize a challenging combat system and vague, almost disconnected pieces of lore that could possibly be interpreted as a complete narrative by those who knew where to look. While it may seem confusing as to why a game whose narrative is not obvious may become popular, take it from the creator of the game. As the writer Alexander Kalasa explains in his article that dissects Bloodborne's music, the Japanese video game designer created these games to simulate his experience in reading English fantasy books. For him, he had to piece things together since he could not understand most of the content in the books. So in these games he makes, like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, a player can do the same. This feeling of putting together the story is part of the fun, and it is also what makes these games so unique. Most people who have studied this game find its themes of maternity to be very intriguing, along with how the game switches from a typical werewolf-killing game to a cosmic horror frenzy. Its large cast, which was further developed by DLC that was released not long after the base game, gave many people a taste for more stories from this world. The game was meant to receive a second DLC, but From Software instead published a new game, Dark Souls 3, and ever since, Bloodborne had been left behind. That was until rumors of a movie adaptation of the game began to spread by trusted sources in early 2024. This joined the massive wave of disappointment from the fans of the game since Bloodborne had not received any updates, well except for a clothing collab, since the DLC released. This lack of content allowed for many memes to be created, including the classic Bloodborneum photo. As mentioned before, the game recently reached a 10-year anniversary, and Sony said nothing. It especially hurt because at least there was a tweet for the 5-year anniversary, but they truly do not care right now. So why worry about a movie that is most likely never coming out? Well, apart from it being fun to pretend that this series will get something new, this game is still a wonderful demonstration of a truly gothic and cosmic horror tale. I think it could become a beloved adaptation that people, or the avid fanbase, might rewatch every Halloween season. My question is, how would a movie work for a game whose lore is very much up to interpretation? Additionally, it's pretty difficult to adapt a video game because in essence, you take away one of the core aspects of video game narratives, the fact that it's interactive. If a movie that directly adapted the main events of the game were made and people found it lackluster due to the playthrough in the movie being different from the playthrough they experienced, it could ultimately soil one of the best functions these From Software games have, the idea that the player themselves must piece together the lore. Thus, how can I make a movie that can satisfy fans of the game, give a good narrative, while also appealing to new audiences? Well, let's address one thing first. It couldn't work as a movie, but rather a TV show. I realize how off-putting it might sound, okay, but trust me, I did research for this one. And to further ease your worries, think of shows like Andor, The Penguin, Severance, Squid Game, and even other video game adaptations like Fallout. All of these came out recently and they're pretty good, so let's bring television into the question. I know the title of this video refers to this adaptation as a movie, but that was mainly because of a certain article. This Fandom Wire article says a Bloodborne movie could be made by Adam Wingard starring Bill Skarsgård. Take a look at Wingard's filmography and we get Death Note. Okay, sure. There's some other horror movies, but let's not turn this into a Baz Luhrmann Joan d'Arc, right? I'll tell you who's a better fit for directing at least a few episodes of this series soon. The reason this would work better as a series is because I think it would be better to focus on the stories already set in stone. This series would make sense of those item descriptions and cryptic dialogue. I think the Bloodborne story overall is too large for a mere 2-hour runtime, especially if you want to get an engaging narrative. A television series would likely have enough time for each piece of lore, prominent figure, or important organization in the game that I do not think a movie would have enough time for. Imagine an episode dedicated to explaining the Old Hunters, or even one simply about Ludwig, another for Gerhman, Lady Maria, and so on. And then, the fun part of the series could be the end of each episode cutting to the Hunter, the character we play, who enters their boss room and kills them. This show could tell the most gut-wrenching story about a character, how they fell into madness because of blood, only for the Hunter to either put them out of their misery or kill them slowly. It could even reference the idea that the Hunters cannot escape the nightmare, so in the first episode, the Hunter might get squashed by Cleric Beast or Father Gascoigne, and as the boss goes to settle down, the Hunter returns moments later fully healed. So, this video will mainly be about the storytelling side of the supposed TV show. I will bring up my research on Gothic literature, adaptations of Gothic tales, essays on Bloodborne's horrific game design, themes, and nightmarish music, as well as my own interpretations of how episodes may look like. Without further ado, let's take a look at how we can make this Bloodborne TV show the best it can be. The first thing I'll discuss is the visual part of this series. Essentially, how will this show look? Who will direct it? Well, a director, cinematographer, and even composer combination that I think would do the world of Bloodborne justice is Robert Eggers, Jaron Blaschke, and Robin Carolyn, considering their work in the 2024 Christmas movie Nosferatu. There's a conversation article written by Megan de Brun-Mollet who reviewed why Nosferatu was a fantastic Gothic horror movie. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it connects well with how to go about portraying Bloodborne stories on the screen, taking Brun-Mollet's recognition of the elements used in the movie to not only make it scary, but very fun for the senses. Brun-Mollet writes, "The preference for close-ups and reaction shots over wide shots and direct action to selectively hide and reveal portions of the scene creates a real sense of claustrophobia and dread as tension builds." This is a great way to separate the adaptation from the game. In the game, the camera typically stays above the character, and it's often far back enough for the player to be able to see everything when it comes to the action. However, this series would theoretically be about the stories of the character, so we would rather use close-ups on these people to humanize them before they become beasts or monsters for us to hunt later. As another example, take this shot in the Bloodborne debut trailer. The reason the shot is so effective is because we don't see the Hunter killing a Yharnamite from afar, but rather we watch the fear frantically flow in his face while the cold barrel of a gun is pushed against his head. This festers a new emotion in this shot, causing us to realize that we are truly, and somewhat unfortunately, emotionless hunters. Moreover, this show should not only be a miserable time with malicious people hunting others. I think it has the ability to make a comment on today's society, as well as allow this show to be a little campy because the game can be quite silly if you think about it. Brun-Mollet writes about Nosferatu, "Nosferatu is a vampire film for our times, when wealthy autocrats literally want to remake the world in their image to control women's bodies and to spin illusions around these desires that dismiss objections as fantastical or hysterical. I find that Bloodborne has characters who fit this, and an external force wanting to control women's bodies is certainly present in both real life and this game. Though, I will get to that pretty soon. As for the campiness, the author continues to say, Nosferatu does not take itself too seriously, but it is a very sincere film. If it makes eccentric decisions, it commits to them fully and unironically. The resulting performances sometimes verge into welcome moments of camp. I think this should be the attitude towards making a show such as this, as it will provide a source of levity for new audiences, and campy or silly moments were most certainly present in the original game. Take the time Patch's chance to Amygdala, or my first playthrough. Finally, the aesthetic, atmosphere, and audio of the movie is phenomenal. There's no reason we should not strive for something like this. Okay, so we know we want Nosferatu as a reference for what this series should look like. With the right budget, I'm sure it's possible. And we all know Sony has millions of dollars they can throw away or simply not capitalize on. Poor Bloodborne remake. But what else do we need? Well, I think it's time to talk about the Gothic part of all this. What is Gothic? How is it different than horror, and which one will we lean towards more? Or maybe the difference is too negligible to worry about, and that's why it's called Gothic Horror. Well, let's do some research. There is a difference between Gothic and horror, and I think it will help with setting the tone of the show. An essay by Shannon Morgan, writer for Crime Reads, sought and explained the difference between the genres, realizing a sensory-related difference. Morgan writes, "The horror writer wants to provoke emotion or a physical, toe-curling, fearful reaction in the reader. Gothic is subtler. It doesn't grab you by the throat to terrify you. Gothic is a gentle creep of dread. This is important because if we consider Bloodborne to be more Gothic than horror, we will have a better understanding of how to create the adaptation. We do not need a jump scare festival, but rather the feeling that something terrible is happening. That dreadful, terrible, nightmarish woe. It is what characterizes these poor people trapped in this nightmare, turned into beasts, slain like dogs in the street. I think going for this subtler route does not mean all jump scares are out of the question. Trust me, there were some scares in the original game, but also, I like to think of nightmares I've had myself when writing a horror project. I think what makes nightmares most terrifying is when you realize you are in one. You know something scary is going to happen. It's only a matter of time before you get scared awake. That dread is something so palpable. I think it would severely benefit the atmosphere of the show, making it a truly wonderful, nightmarish piece of Gothic media. Another good interpretation of the Gothic horror genre is a piece written by the author Seanan McGuire. There's a look to it, something related to Gothic architecture, yes, but as McGuire writes, Gothic horror was an intentional extension of the Romantic school, making it as much a subgenre of romance as it is of horror. It is a very conservative genre. While things may not end happily, we know that when they're over, the sun will rise. Gothic horror is comforting, like an embrace from a large mothball-scented blanket that may or may not come to life and devour people who try to break into the house. This interpretation is useful too because it allows us to remember the real emotion of this show. Though this nightmare is awful and a lot of people suffer, the audience must know that they will return to the waking world. There, they will watch the sun rise in the streets of Yharnam after a blood moon, and perhaps find their worth and a new reason to keep fighting whatever problems they have in real life. That is why Gothic horror is so great. It is something that we must capitalize on for this project. While those previous sources were about Gothic horror in general, there are writers who have connected the elements of Bloodborne to the guidelines and rules of the Gothic and horror genres, finding out why the nightmare is so well created and why it's considered one of the best Gothic narratives made. A fantastic read by Oliver Langmead wrote an article that considered ways Bloodborne uses a broad range of Gothic themes in his narrative. Langmead recognizes the writer Fred Botting's book, Gothic, which argued that the genre died sometime in the early 90s. Of course, claiming a genre can die is absurd, especially with so many untold stories soon on the rise, which is why the author later wrote Limits of Horror. But anyways, what Langmead cited from this book really stood out to me. As Botting wrote about Dracula in 1992, Langmead cites transgression, horrors, and diabolical laughter, brilliant gloom and rich darkness, artificial and suggestive forms. Is this not similar to Bloodborne? I think that description fits a lot of elements from this game, and if we recall that our Bloodborne adaptation will be like 2024's Nosferatu, and if Nosferatu is based on Dracula, then this definitely works. These essentials, darkness, isolation, laughter, and simply horrors, are all sensory elements that will need to be in this series to ensure that it has a Gothic feel to it. Further on in the article, Langmead takes the central plot of the game and finds the Gothic elements within it. The central plot of the game, which I will dive further into in the following section of this video, is basically this. In the world of Bloodborne, there are these things known as Greater Ones, and a certain group of people found the body of a weaker one and were able to take its blood. This old blood was then administered to the people of Yharnam because it could cure any illness. So people came far and wide to get it, but the unfortunate side effect was that the blood was turning people into beasts. Thus, hunters were created to hunt those beasts. Of course, as you play the game and encounter more hunters, you might come to realize that even some of those hunters are becoming beasts, and you have to be the one to put them down. Pretty creepy, right? Well, regarding Botting's critics of Gothic literature, Langmead writes, Botting considers Gothic narratives to broadly feature threats associated with supernatural and natural forces. which in this case would be the transformed beasts and blood-mad rival hunters. There are more examples in the article, but as we can hopefully gather from this, Bloodborne fits perfectly in the world of Gothic literature. The madness, the blood, the nightmares, the beasts, and the supernatural elements, from basic werewolves to cosmic threats. This narrative is truly a wonderful Gothic tale. So what else is required to ensure that this adaptation is good? Well, I would argue it's one of the most prominent parts of Bloodborne's identity: the music. The music in Bloodborne is so iconic. I remember listening to the title screen theme all the way through for the first time, and I was in awe. I kept listening to The Night Unfurls, Cleric Beast, and Bloodborne because I did not want to spoil myself on the other songs before I reached them in-game. Turns out I was streaming those songs for months because I could not get past Cleric Beast on my first ever run of the game, and I deleted it for 6 months before trying again. Anyways, for the sake of new audiences, we need to evoke this feeling of awe and a little terror with the soundtrack, making the show even more addictive. I personally think it would be nice to have the opening credits play The Night Unfurls, since I love that song so much, but let's get into what elements of the soundtrack make it so amazing. A dissection of the music and sounds in Bloodborne was written by Alexander Kolosa in 2020, which we will use as a reference for finding the right kinds of sounds to put in the show. Now, Kolosa explains how the composers of the original game called their style of music, saying they problematically dubbed the agreed style Victorian Gothic. The producer's contradictory notion of the Victorian encompass a broad interpretation of what is commercially known as classical music. Okay, so with this, we know to go for classical music as a genre. While this may have been obvious, it is good to know that some studios prefer to break the period part of a period piece and throw in a needle drop of modern music. As popular as Sabrina Carpenter is, we do not need a classical remix of her song playing when the Pthumerian queen gets impregnated by a great one. Moreover, to get a further understanding of what specific inspiration was used, Kolosa cites Penka Kuneva, a composer and orchestrator of the game, who highlighted the thoroughly un-Victorian composers György Ligeti and Alban Berg. If you have not heard a Ligeti song, listen to this. The reason we are seeking more composers as reference in a game that already has an extensive soundtrack is because most of the songs in the album are for boss fights. Much of the environment of the game does not have background music, unlike later FromSoft games like Elden Ring. I know it is not impossible to make a show that does not have background music, but part of the experience of visual storytelling such as movies and TV is that the score is just as important as the scene. Thus, Ligeti, Berg, and even Robin Carolyn, who worked on Nosferatu, would be great references, or the latter, someone to hire, for scenes that won't use music from the original game. Kolosa also finds reason as to why the game's soundtrack is so haunting. The author describes how chants and rituals are used in a Gothic soundscape, and he even mentions the Cleric Beast score, which uses a Latin chorus, and the dissonant notes that come with it. This method is something that should be utilized to keep that Gothic soundscape in scenes without great beasts like the Cleric Beast, if they still contain horrific things. Moreover, Kolosa notes how Bloodborne's horror lies not in the unknown, but in its repetition and successive confrontations with the unmusical monster. The original chanting in the Nightmare Frontier, the first sight of a Great One, a flashback on the Pthumerian society. If all of these supposed things were adapted and shown in the series, and if they included the elements found in the original game's soundtrack, such as the aforementioned haunting repetition, then it would not only make for a great cohesive atmosphere and auditory experience, but also fantastic additions to your Bloodborne playlist. Finally, I want to make sure this adaptation has an underlying message, as most Gothic literature does. I want it to be as relevant to today's time while also reiterating what the original game had to say. I found that Bloodborne had a lot to do with maternity, womanhood, pregnancy, and the fears that came with it. Within the game, I found that there were obvious signs that the narrative was related to these things. Take the Pthumerian queen having her womb bloodied, the echoes of a baby crying, and empty carriages in the street. The literal Nightmare of Mensis and the Blood Moon are great examples. This game clearly has something to do with womanhood and childbirth, at the very least. A well-written blog by someone named Rennerith connected the details of these themes greatly. The article explores the theme of maternity and how it is used horrifically in a Gothic tale. Rennerith provides a great number of examples of how to interpret the item descriptions in the game, and specifically explores the umbilical cords and blood moon that cause great changes to the game's narrative and characters. With these examples from the game, it allows for a simplified way to interpret the game's cryptic story, which is great for new audiences. The explanation of how the blood moon leads to women becoming impregnated by extraterrestrial beings is well explained, and connecting it to biblical themes is well thought out too, something I had not considered. Describing the character Ariana, who, unbeknownst to her, becomes pregnant and later gives birth to a deformed creature as being similar to the Virgin Mary, but instead she was raped by a god and given an unholy pregnancy, was a fantastic interpretation. The author also takes the time to highlight how other characters likely felt throughout the events of the game, putting into context how the actions of the players may affect them. Essentially, what this article showed me was that this crucial yet dark theme of maternity is something that cannot be omitted in an adaptation of the game. I think this is relevant in today's society because in America now, abortions are illegal in most places, and there are many horror stories and movies being made now, or have been made, that highlight the horrific idea of being forced to endure an unwanted pregnancy, especially if what is birthed is a horrific monster, like Alien Romulus and Beetlejuice, for example. I especially like Rainer's contextualization of the character Ariana, who becomes pregnant during the game. The author writes, Ariana is shocked for this abuse, practically raped by a mysterious entity that impregnated her against her will. She gave birth to a monster. Also, this unholy pregnancy is quite similar to the Immaculate Conception for Virgin Mary, just in a nightmarish way. There is no angel this time to announce it, just an enigmatic god who decided to fecundate random women with his inauspicious seed. This sort of description is so tactile and horrific, and I think if we can evoke the same feeling in the series, it would create for a new understanding of how dire the situation is for most of the unfortunate women in the game who become pregnant against their will. It may allow for more reflection on today's society and where things like abortion laws and female autonomy will head in the future. Moreover, what originally was meant to be a prequel series is now thought, in my mind, to be a series that selectively weaves through time to convey a narrative of this game in the best, most easiest way to digest. I want to give the viewer a feeling that there is a lot unknown, but not so much that they must do their own homework later. What would be interesting is showing how the people of the game's Gothic city Yharnam came about finding the Greater Ones, and how this ritual of seeking women to impregnate during a blood moon would affect characters on side quests. This would be done by presenting a flashback, and then ending a supposed episode with the main hunter character encountering the subject of the flashback. This encounter could be a boss battle or something involving slaughtering, as a hunter is meant to hunt after all. By simply following the events of the game that everyone would eventually come across without going into the little details, it allows for this adaptation to be easy to follow for new viewers, but hopefully a delight for seasoned players, as they recognize key moments. After all of that, I think it's time to take a look at what a couple example episodes of this show may look like. For good direction on what interpretation of the lore we are using for these example episodes, I'll be citing the Australian YouTuber VaatiVidya, as he is a well-regarded source for lore interpretation of the Soulsborne games, and the Bloodborne wiki for smaller details. I will only list 2 episodes for the sake of time, but if you guys want a full series with more in-depth outlines, I'm sure that if this video gets popular, I or more experienced people will be invited to a writer's room to devise more episodes. The goal here is to tell the story, make it simple enough for general audiences to understand, while also keeping it a mystery, and of course, keep it gothic. These episodes may also be quite long, but with today's format of hour-long episodes packed into an 8-episode season, it should be no problem. Additionally, I'm imagining this as live action, but an animated series is always welcome. Episode 1 will be about the discovery of the Great Ones, and essentially be the context as to why the game's story is happening. Once again, this will be paraphrasing VaatiVidya's interpretation, but if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them below in the comments section. I would like to see a nebulous prologue of some sort presenting the Dumerians in the Chalice dungeons, and it would end with the hunters finding a Great One, but of course, in the show's horrific nature, it would show the hunters' up-close reaction to the being, and then, perhaps as a jump scare, a close-up of the Great One's eyes, like Abrida's, before cutting to black. Then, the opening credits would play. This prologue would provide the atmosphere we need, the reactions that I saw from the Nosferatu movie, a haunting score, and the feeling of dread that there's an incomprehensible being somewhere in this show. The rest of the episode would follow Master Willem, the Bergenworth scholars entering the tombs and discovering the healing church, Carol's creation of the runes, and the frenzy that, as Vadi Video describes it,
you should have some idea of the scale of ambition of these characters. With the discovery of beings greater than them came a desire to ascend into godhood, to push humanity into its next stage of evolution. The only question was, how?
This infatuation with supernatural elements fits the Gothic narrative as I explained before, and it should be here that the audiences will see how this ambition will lead to the downfall of this society. The two feuding ideals, whether man needs blood or insight, is what drives the main conflict of the episode, and we should see more of Laurence's blood-like craze in this episode, with foreshadowing to his eventual state in the DLC throughout it. It should also follow him leading the church and distributing the old blood to the people of Yharnam to heal them, and as the story continues, we should see the first Scourge of the Beasts. The episode would be around halfway finished by this point. Once the beasts run rampant, it can be scary, but Laurence will work with Gerhman to establish a hunter's workshop to kill the beasts, where we will see prominent figures later like Ludwig, Lady Maria and her distaste towards using blood for her weapon, other vile bloods, and even a hunter of hunters, like Eileen, though not as prevalent. We need to see how intense this hunt will become, leading Laurence to want to burn all of Old Yharnam. From there, we could even see Tajura find empathy for the beasts there and claim he will protect them from hunters with his Gatling gun. And then, in the final stretch of the episode, Laurence will show signs that he's becoming a beast. New audiences will hopefully connect the dots that he took some old blood himself, but also that this is a sign of his growing fear. He becomes something like the Cleric Beast, though of course a lot more fiery. The events between his transformation into the beast and when the beastly scourge began will mostly be omitted on purpose, as many characters and covenants are involved in it. The episode will end with a time skip, and the hunter that we play will get their own blood transfusion, travel through Yharnam, and encounter the Cleric Beast. Will the fight be shown? Maybe in the next episode. We need to keep the audiences hooked. The purpose of this episode is to be a sample of what the horrific story of Bloodborne is. It may be fast-paced, but we can also make it over an hour long. I mean, have you seen how many hours Stranger Things 4 is? Anyways, hopefully this episode provides just enough details to make questions in the viewer's mind. This single episode has to be good enough to get people to either keep watching or play the game. If they are still curious, then it's time to press next episode and get a slower-paced story that the rest of the season may follow. This episode may open with the hunter awakening in the hunter's dream after theoretically being flattened by the Cleric Beast in the last episode. We see them stand up, approach the doll, and watch her come to life, since the hunter would have insight by this point. We hear her say the first thing she says to the player.
Hello, good hunter. I am a doll, here in this dream to look after you.
And we cut to Gerhman, looking from inside the workshop, watching the conversation go down in a somber state. Then, a flashback. This episode will mainly be about Gerhman establishing the Hunter's Workshop with the Healing Church, its downfall, as well as his infatuation with Lady Maria. I would like it to include some references to Lady Maria's relation to the Queen of Vilebloods and her first time hunting with Gerhman. They should have some chemistry. The episode should continue developing the student-master relationship until we get to Maria and the other old hunters making their way to the fishing hamlet to harvest the blood off of Kosa's body, leading to her imprisonment in the nightmare. It might also include, near the beginning of her hunts, her love for the Rakuyo, and then at this point, her departure from it as she could not stomach it anymore. She dies near the hamlet, having her soul forever trapped in the hunter's nightmare. From Gerhman's perspective, he's still in love with her, but he figures she merely disappeared, so he tried to recreate her with the doll. This is a side note, but I think a nice plot thread would be having the hunter, in a later episode, explore the abandoned old workshop and find the doll there and an umbilical cord. And speaking of the old workshop, I think at this point in the episode, Gerhman will be left behind as Ludwig leads new hunters to work for the Healing Church. In his lonesome, he will create the doll, be bound by the moon presence, and realize his new purpose of ensuring that the hunter we play as frees him. The flashback will conclude on a close-up of Gerhman intensely closing his eyes after witnessing these nightmares. Flashes of the moon presence, of Maria's corpse, of creating the doll and using it for pleasure, of the hunters leaving, and then we hear,
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
The flashback ends in a match cut, and the hunter goes to talk to Gerhman, where he will give the usual spiel we hear in the game. This hopefully will be a good episode for fans who simply wanted to see this story told on screen, and for new audiences of course. And As stated before, some things were omitted, like how I mentioned Ludwig, so the next episode could follow him, or another hunter like Father Gascoigne, or possibly both. In conclusion, the video game Bloodborne would work better as a TV series than a movie simply due to its large, rich, gothic narrative with plenty of characters and stories to follow. Though this is hypothetical, as it is very unlikely that Sony will remember to do anything with this game before the 15th anniversary, this TV series would still make for great gothic media and a wonderful piece of fiction for generations to see. The lore of Bloodborne is so chilling, weird, scary, and eerie that those sample episodes could only be the beginning. As you may recall, I did not even bring up pregnancy in either of those episodes, as both of those explored other themes, making the supposed series full of messages the viewer can take away from it. Overall, I would love to see a series like this, and if they still try to make a movie from it, hopefully a lengthy movie series that has October or March releases in the years between Robert Eggers' horror pieces. I would also like to be casted in them. If that interests you and you like this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, comment what Bloodborne stories you would want to see adapted to the screen, and share this video with a friend. Remember, this video is quite lengthy because it was a paper for school, but I really hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. Remember to fear the old blood, and I'm gonna go find my worth in the waking world. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.